October 25, 1944. Dawn off the coast of Samar. The sea was glass smooth when Ensign William Brooks first spotted them on the horizon. 7 shapes, dark and massive, emerging from the gray morning mist like iron ghosts. He pressed the binoculars harder against his face, adjusting focus, and felt his stomach drop. Pagoda masts, the unmistakable silhouettes of Japanese battleships. 4 of them, and behind them, heavy cruisers, their turrets already turning toward his ship. Brooks was 23 years old, stationed aboard the escort carrier Gambier Bay, and in that moment he understood with absolute clarity that he was about to die. The Gambier Bay was not a warship in any meaningful sense. She was a converted merchant hull, thin-skinned and slow, designed to ferry aircraft to forward positions, not to engage enemy capital ships. Her maximum speed was 17 knots. The battleship Yamato, now bearing down on her from 20 miles away, could make 27. Her armor plating was 3/4 of an inch thick. Yamato's belt armor was 16 inches of hardened steel. The escort carrier's largest guns were 5-inch deck mounts, useful against aircraft, useless against battleships. Yamato's main batteries were 18.1-inch naval rifles, the largest ever mounted on a warship, capable of hurling shells weighing nearly 3,000 pounds across 25 miles of ocean. It was not a fair fight. It was not even a fight. It was an execution. And yet, somehow, impossibly, Gambier Bay and her sister escort carriers would survive long enough to change the course of the largest naval battle in history. Not because they were strong, but because the men who sailed them refused to accept the mathematics of their own destruction, and because the U.S. Navy, which the Japanese had long dismissed as reckless and undisciplined, had cultivated a doctrine of aggressive audacity that defied every principle of naval warfare the Imperial Japanese Navy held sacred. To understand what happened off Samar that morning requires stepping back 4 years to a time when the Japanese Navy was the most formidable maritime force in the Pacific, and the American Navy was regarded by Japanese planners as a collection of wealthy amateurs playing at war. In 1940, the Imperial Japanese Navy was the product of 60 years of relentless modernization and tactical refinement. Since the Meiji Restoration, Japan had studied under the great naval powers, Britain, Germany, the United States, and had synthesized their doctrines into something uniquely Japanese, a philosophy of decisive battle, where superior training, superior night fighting tactics, and superior spirit would overcome any material disadvantage. The IJN had annihilated the Russian fleet at Tsushima in 1905. It had pioneered aircraft carrier operations in the 1920s. Its officers were educated in rigorous naval academies where strategy was studied with the intensity of religious doctrine. And by 1941, it possessed the most experienced carrier pilots in the world, the most advanced torpedo technology, and a fleet built for a single, overwhelming strike that would cripple any opponent before the war truly began.
The Americans, by contrast, were seen as undisciplined. Their navy was large, certainly, fed by an industrial base the Japanese both envied and resented, but size was not skill. Japanese naval officers studying U.S. fleet exercises through intelligence reports and observations noted a troubling pattern. American commanders took risks that no sensible naval officer would consider. They divided their forces unnecessarily. They operated carriers aggressively, often dangerously close to enemy positions. They seemed to prioritize speed of action over careful planning. To the Japanese mind, schooled in the teachings of Mahan and Togo, this was not boldness, it was recklessness. And recklessness, the Japanese believed, would be punished by the ocean itself. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, understood American industrial capacity better than most of his peers. He had studied at Harvard, had served as a naval attaché in Washington, had walked through American factories and seen the automobile assembly lines that could be converted to warship production. He knew what America was capable of building. But he also believed, perhaps had to believe, that industrial capacity alone could not win wars, that superior training and fighting spirit could overcome material superiority, that a decisive early victory could shatter American morale and force a negotiated peace before the industrial giant fully awakened. Pearl Harbor was supposed to be that victory, and in tactical terms it was. 8 battleships sunk or damaged, over 2,000 Americans dead, the Pacific Fleet crippled. But Yamamoto had missed the aircraft carriers. They were at sea during the attack, and in that absence lay the seed of everything that followed. Because the U.S. Navy, stripped of its battleships, did something the Japanese never anticipated. It became reckless by necessity. With the battle line destroyed, American carrier commanders had no choice but to operate aggressively. There was no secure battle fleet to fall back on, no conventional naval doctrine that could be applied. And so they attacked. 3 months after Pearl Harbor, carrier aircraft struck Japanese positions in the Marshall Islands. In April 1942, 16 B-25 bombers launched from the carrier Hornet, an impossible feat that violated every principle of carrier aviation, and bombed Tokyo. The Doolittle raid accomplished little materially, but psychologically it was devastating. The Japanese High Command had assured the Emperor that the home islands were invulnerable. And yet American bombers had appeared over Tokyo, launched from a carrier that should not have been able to operate that close to Japan, flown by crews who seemed indifferent to the suicidal nature of their mission. It was reckless, and it worked. At Coral Sea in May 1942, American carriers fought the first naval battle in history where surface ships never sighted each other. At Midway, 1 month later, 3 Japanese fleet carriers were destroyed in 5 minutes by dive bombers that should never have found them, launched from American carriers that were outnumbered and outgunned. Japanese observers analyzing the battle afterwards noted the chaotic nature of American attacks, uncoordinated, piecemeal, seemingly improvised, and yet the Japanese had lost, decisively. The pattern repeated at Guadalcanal, at the Philippine Sea. At every engagement, the Americans seemed to violate sound naval doctrine, seemed to take risks no prudent commander would accept, and yet they kept winning. Not because of superior tactics, Japanese tactics were often better, but because American commanders had internalized a fundamental truth the Japanese could not accept. That in modern naval warfare, aggression itself was a weapon, that hesitation was more dangerous than recklessness, that a navy willing to absorb losses and keep attacking would eventually overwhelm a navy that fought for preservation.
The symbolic embodiment of this philosophy was not a battleship or a carrier, but something far more mundane: the destroyer. American destroyers were mass-produced, lightly armored, and disposable by the standards of capital ship warfare. They were built in shipyards across the nation, Bath, Quincy, San Francisco, rolling off production lines at a rate the Japanese could not match. By 1944, the U.S. Navy was commissioning 3 destroyers per week. 3! The Japanese, struggling to replace losses from 2 years of attrition warfare, were building perhaps 1 per month. And American doctrine used these destroyers not as screening vessels to protect larger ships, but as offensive weapons. Destroyer squadrons were expected to charge enemy battle lines, launch torpedo attacks at point-blank range, and disrupt enemy formations, even if it meant their own destruction. It was a doctrine born of abundance. A nation that could build destroyers faster than they could be sunk could afford to treat them as expendable.
The Japanese, who agonized over every lost warship, who held elaborate funerals for sunken vessels, who believed that ships and crews were irreplaceable treasures to be husbanded carefully, found this approach incomprehensible. It was wasteful, it was dishonorable, it was reckless. And by October 1944, it had brought Japan to the brink of collapse. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was Japan's last gamble. The plan was complex, elegant, and desperate. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita would lead a powerful surface force, including the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, through the San Bernardino Strait, swing south, and annihilate the American invasion fleet landing troops at Leyte. A separate force under Admiral Shoji Nishimura would attack through Surigao Strait to the south, and Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa would lead Japan's remaining carriers, empty of most aircraft, north as a decoy, luring the American fast carriers away from the landing beaches. It was a plan that required perfect timing, perfect communication, and perfect execution. It received none of these. On October 24, American submarines ambushed Kurita's force in the Palawan Passage, sinking 2 heavy cruisers. Later that day, carrier aircraft found Kurita in the Sibuyan Sea and subjected his fleet to wave after wave of attacks. The Musashi, struck by an estimated 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs, capsized and sank, the most powerful battleship ever lost to air attack. Kurita, shaken, turned back, but then, inexplicably, he reversed course again and continued toward San Bernardino Strait. To the south, Nishimura's force entered Surigao Strait and sailed directly into the most perfectly executed ambush in naval history. American battleships, including several resurrected from Pearl Harbor, formed a battle line across the strait's northern exit and annihilated the Japanese force in a night surface action. Nishimura went down with his flagship. The strait became a graveyard. And to the north, Ozawa's decoy worked perfectly. Admiral William Halsey, commanding the U.S. Third Fleet, took the bait and steamed north with every fast carrier and battleship under his command, leaving San Bernardino Strait unguarded. Which is how, at dawn on October 25th, Kurita's battered but still powerful force emerged from the strait and found themselves facing not the American battle line, but a handful of escort carriers and destroyers off the coast of Samar. Taffy 3, they were called. 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, 4 destroyer escorts, and they were alone. Ensign Brooks watched the Japanese ships close the range. The Gambier Bay was already making smoke, laying a chemical screen to obscure the escort carriers, but it was futile. The Japanese could see them on radar. And at 6:59 a.m., Yamato opened fire. Her first salvo fell short, throwing up geysers of water 200 feet high, colored red and blue and green from dye markers the Japanese used to differentiate each ship's fall of shot. The second salvo straddled Gambier Bay. The third found her. The destroyer Johnston, commanded by Commander Ernest Evans, did not wait for orders. Evans was a Cherokee from Oklahoma, 40 years old, and he had sworn when he commissioned Johnston that he would never retreat from an enemy force. At 7 a.m., with the Japanese fleet still 15 miles away, he ordered flank speed and charged directly at the battleships, alone. A single destroyer, displacing 2,000 tons, attacking a battle line that outweighed her by 100 to 1. It was reckless, suicidal, irrational. It was also exactly what American doctrine demanded. Johnston closed to 10,000 yards, point-blank range in naval terms, and launched her torpedoes. One struck the heavy cruiser Kumano, blowing off her bow and forcing her out of the battle. Evans then turned Johnston broadside and engaged the Japanese column with his 5-inch guns, shells that could barely scratch a battleship's armor. But Evans wasn't trying to sink battleships. He was trying to disrupt their formation, to force them to maneuver, to buy time for the carriers to escape. And it worked.
The Japanese, confronted by this insane attack, assumed Johnston must be the vanguard of a larger force. No single destroyer would charge a battle line unless battleships were following. Kurita, already shaken from 2 days of air attacks, hesitated. His formation began to break up as individual captains maneuvered to avoid torpedoes, real or imagined. Then the destroyers Hull and Heermann joined the attack. Then the destroyer escorts Samuel B. Roberts, Dennis, and John C. Butler. Small ships, built in months rather than years, crewed by men barely out of training, throwing themselves at the most powerful battleships in the world. The Samuel B. Roberts, displacing just 1,300 tons, closed to 4,000 yards and fired her torpedoes at the heavy cruiser Chokai. Then she continued firing her guns, loading and firing so rapidly that the barrels glowed red. She fired 600 rounds before Japanese shells tore her apart. Her survivors would call her the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship. Aboard Gambier Bay, Brooks felt the ship shudder as an 8-inch shell from the cruiser Chikuma tore through the engine room. The carrier began to slow. More shells struck, through the flight deck, through the hangar bay, through the hull. She was dying. But she had survived for 2 hours against a force that should have annihilated her in minutes. 2 hours. Long enough for American reinforcements to arrive, long enough for carrier aircraft from other task groups to converge on Kurita's fleet, long enough for the Japanese admiral, overwhelmed by the chaos of the battle, to conclude that he was not facing a handful of escort carriers, but the main American fleet. At 9:11 a.m., with victory in his grasp, Kurita ordered a retreat.
The Japanese had called the U.S. Navy reckless, and they were right. The charge off Samar violated every principle of sound naval tactics. Destroyers do not attack battleships. Escort carriers do not stand and fight. No rational commander orders a 2,000-ton warship to charge a fleet that outguns her 1,000 to 1. And yet, that is precisely what happened. Because the U.S. Navy had cultivated a culture where aggression was reflex, where initiative was valued over caution, where junior officers were trained to attack when in doubt. It was a culture born of abundance, of knowing that lost ships could be replaced, that lost crews would be avenged, that the industrial base back home was producing more destroyers every week than the enemy could sink in a month. The Japanese fought to preserve, the Americans fought to spend, and in that difference lay the outcome of the war. Gambier Bay sank at 9:07 a.m., the only U.S. aircraft carrier ever sunk by surface gunfire. Johnston, Hull, and Samuel B. Roberts went down fighting, their crews picked up hours or days later by rescue vessels. Commander Evans went down with his ship. He was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. Over 1,000 American sailors died off Samar, but the invasion fleet at Leyte was saved. The Japanese Navy, though still afloat, never again sortied as a unified force. Leyte Gulf was the largest naval battle in history, involving over 300 ships and 200,000 men. And the decisive moment had come not from battleships or carriers, but from a handful of destroyers willing to die recklessly. There is a photograph, taken weeks after the battle, of survivors from Samuel B. Roberts standing on the deck of a rescue ship. They are gaunt, sunburned, exhausted, but they are smiling, because they had charged battleships in a destroyer escort and lived to tell about it, because they had done something so reckless, so impossible, that it had become legend, and because they understood, perhaps better than the admirals or the historians, that recklessness was not a flaw in American naval doctrine, it was the doctrine. The Japanese had built their navy on the principle that careful planning and superior training could overcome material disadvantage. They had studied Tsushima and Jutland, had internalized the lessons of decisive battle, had believed that one perfect engagement could turn the tide of war.
But modern war was not decided by perfect engagements. It was decided by 100 imperfect ones, by the willingness to accept losses and continue attacking, by a philosophy that valued aggression over preservation. The Americans did not fight better than the Japanese. They fought more, and in a war of attrition, more was everything. The destroyer became the symbol of this philosophy. Not the sleek, powerful destroyers of pre-war designs, but the mass-produced Fletcher-class and Sumner-class ships that poured out of American shipyards by the dozens. They were not beautiful, they were not particularly advanced, but they were abundant. And abundance, deployed with aggressive audacity, proved more valuable than any amount of tactical sophistication. After Leyte Gulf, the Japanese Navy effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Its remaining carriers had no aircraft, its battleships had no fuel, its cruisers and destroyers were scattered across the Pacific, hunted by American submarines and aircraft. The kamikaze attacks that followed, suicide planes crashing into American ships, were a final, desperate admission that conventional naval warfare was lost. Japan could no longer fight the U.S. Navy ship to ship. All that remained was to die expensively and hope the Americans would lose the will to continue. But the Americans did not lose will. They absorbed the kamikaze attacks, buried the dead, repaired the damaged ships, and kept coming. Because the U.S. Navy was not built on the idea that ships were precious. It was built on the idea that ships were tools, and tools could be replaced. And a nation that treated warships as disposable, that could afford to lose destroyers by the dozen and carriers by the handful and still maintain offensive operations, was a nation that could not be defeated by any enemy that counted costs.
The lesson of Leyte Gulf was not that the Americans were better sailors than the Japanese. The records suggest they were not. Japanese torpedoes were superior. Japanese night fighting tactics were more refined. Japanese naval gunnery was, ship for ship, more accurate. But the Americans won because they had institutionalized recklessness, had made aggression the default response, had trained every commander to attack even when the odds were hopeless. And that recklessness, backed by industrial abundance, proved unstoppable. Ensign Brooks survived the sinking of Gambier Bay. He spent 13 hours in the water before being picked up by a destroyer. He would later write that the most surreal moment of the battle was watching Johnston charge the Japanese fleet alone, a single destroyer disappearing into her own smokescreen, her guns still firing. He said it looked like something from a myth, a hero's death from an ancient epic, except it was real, and it had worked. The destroyer, more than any battleship or carrier, embodied what the Japanese had called reckless. It was expendable, aggressive, built for offense rather than survival. And in the hands of a navy that valued initiative over caution, it became the weapon that won the Pacific, not through careful planning or superior technology, but through a willingness to charge into impossible situations and trust that audacity itself could change outcomes. By the end of 1944, the U.S. Navy had achieved total maritime dominance in the Pacific, not because it had better ships, though by that point it did, but because it had better doctrine, a doctrine that said, when in doubt, attack, when outnumbered, attack, when outgunned, attack. It was wasteful, it was costly, it was by any measure of traditional naval wisdom reckless, but it was also unbeatable. The Japanese had called the U.S. Navy reckless, and in the waters off Samar, surrounded by the wreckage of ships that had charged battleships and died trying, that recklessness had saved an invasion fleet and doomed an empire. Because in the end, the side that could afford to be reckless, that could lose destroyers and build more, that could spend lives and replace them, that could gamble everything on audacity and still have reserves, that side would always defeat the side that fought to preserve what it could not afford to lose. The destroyer was the proof, mass-produced, disposable, and deadly in the hands of men willing to use it. And in that willingness, in that cultivated recklessness, lay the truth about how democracies wage war,
not with elegance or efficiency, but with abundance and aggression, not by avoiding losses, but by accepting them and attacking anyway. The Japanese had dismissed this as unsophisticated, as the flailing of amateurs, but off the coast of Samar, with destroyers charging battleships and escort carriers standing to fight, it became clear what recklessness really was. It was victory, raw, brutal, and undeniable.